All right, we're doing another mini micro podcast here. Again, just a solo show with Greg Lehman, the original movement optimist, and that's what we're talking about today: is movement optimism versus, movement nihilism, which I was first accused of more than a decade ago, where the nihilism kind of says that mechanics don't matter. And if you Google me, you'll see tons of articles where we've written that mechanics are important, just not in the way that you think. you know? So I think you're wrong. I'm not wrong. So we're going to talk about when biomechanics matters in terms of rehab and potentially injury prevention. The biggest one, of course, is high load activities. So this is simple. The higher the load is, the fewer options you have. If you're jumping off a roof, there's less ways that you can land. Like, you obviously couldn't land on one hand, or in a handstand position, or just with a fully straight knee. You could probably get into some pretty weird positions, provided like that you've accommodated that tissue and built it up over time. You'll see that with jaws and skateboarding, landing with massive knee valgus, which is totally normal. It's one way to absorb load, just not in the sagittal plane, but we see it in the frontal plane. So high load activities, when the stress on the tissue really gets near its failure mechanism. And you could maybe even argue this, which has always been a caveat for me for a decade, of hamstring tears. That might be the one area where technique might make a little bit of a difference. And what I'm thinking about here would be Chris Brahma's research, which is relatively new and it is promising. We've always acknowledged that, because at a full sprint, you might be getting near the tissue tolerance. At the same time, though, that doesn't mean that movement preparation isn't important, and we'll get into that soon. Okay, number two, where mechanics matters, is like, don't be an idiot, too much too soon. So we know that you can adapt, but of course, adaptability is finite and it takes time. So you just have to respect the ecosystem and respect your ability to adapt. But even what's cool with something like that, which is about biomechanics, is we don't adapt in a vacuum, right? You are an ecosystem. So this is where all of the biopsychosocial factors come in. So you stress the body, and if you're not in the best position to adapt, if the state of your organism isn't in the best state, then it doesn't matter how slowly you load it. You can adapt appropriately. So the best, simplest example would be like bone stress injuries and REDS, or relative energy deficiency. If you're not fueling and you have low energy availability, your system isn't ready for this. Or you could talk about sleep. We know that sleep is associated with stress fractures and injuries. Or you could talk about high levels of academic stress or emotional stress. So if the system isn't ready for these stressors, the biomechanics, then you can't adapt that well. So too much too soon is important. And in the chronic pain world, it's the same idea. This would be an endurance coper. It's just too much for them right now in the state that they're in. And often in the chronic pain world, the state that they're in is that they don't have any good beliefs or any optimism about their condition, right? And so that means that they'll view a movement that's sensitive as inherently dangerous when it's not dangerous. And if they view it negatively, they'll respond negatively to those movements, and they don't adapt well. And then another simple way, you'll see me write articles saying there's no one right way to run, and we shouldn't be changing how people their running technique. But that's when they're not injured, right? When someone's injured or when something hurts, by all means, change the stress. Just simply shift the stress. This is simple. This is the George Costanza school of rehab. If whatever you're doing in life is wrong, then you do the opposite. So, of course, we can change how you move. If I do a deadlift and my spine is really flexed, and for some reason I'm sensitive to flexion, it's not unreasonable to train with a less flexed spine for a couple weeks or for that session, right? If or vice versa, which is more me. If I lift with a really neutral spine, I don't like it. I don't like spine extension for whatever reason. And it's easy for me to change my technique, and so I'll lift with that. If I'm running and my heel is sore, then I tend to run more on my forefoot or midfoot. It's not by heel, sorry, I mean the Achilles. It's not unreasonable to run with a more with a heel strike, right? All of these things are on the table, provided you slowly build up, your tolerance to those movements. So, being a movement optimist is more about movement options rather than, movement quality would be the idea there. And then to get into the nitty gritty, because then people say, Greg, well, you don't really test strength or range of motion. I'm like, that's not true. I just don't inherently say that being weak is a risk factor for injury, or being tight or lacking a certain range of motion is an inherent problem. Where these biomotor abilities might be relevant in the stress shifting space is if your treatment strategy is, let's teach you another way to move that might be less sensitive, if that's your style of practice, cool. You have to have the biomotor abilities to do that. So if you're doing a squat and you tend to have a really upright shank, your lower leg, and you're quite flexed at the hips, and for some reason you're like, well, we don't want to do it that way. We want to decrease the stress on the spine or the hip, whatever your reasoning is for that. In order to do that, you have to be more upright when you're doing a squat. In order to be more upright when you're doing a squat, you have to have more ankle dorsiflexion. So there's just that limited biomotor ability is relevant there, or it could be strength. I do backflips, I strain my abs every now and then. It feels better if I'm not fully arched when I'm in that position. Well, I would need the ab strength to do the backflip without that stress. Or you could argue, if I could jump higher when I do those backflips, that would require less ab positioning at a really extended position, which is a bit harder on muscles if I'm not prepared for it and I want to decrease the load there. So if I could jump higher, just spend all day on my trampoline, it's in my backyard, then that's when we would do that. So the fourth area where biomechanics matters is that we fundamentally believe with movement optimism that movement preparation, right, trumps movement quality. So you can get into these weird positions and thrive with them, provided you slowly build up your tolerance to them. And now this is where specificity can matter, right? You say, there's certain tissues that I want to build up in my training. Well, you need to know the biomechanics of movement to say what positions and what stressors will build up those tissues. So that matters. Like if you want to build up your hamstrings for sprinting, so sprinting's going to be great, of course, but you couldn't just say, let's do squats, right? Because the squat isn't really a great hamstring load, right? Because you have knee flexion and hip flexion. That's where you'd have to know your biomechanics. So when you want to target, specific tissue, biomechanics matters. If you want to load the glute med, again, the glute med primarily functions in the frontal plane, right? You have to have some sort of moment in the frontal plane about the hip to load the glute med. So you, again, can't just do bilateral squats because there's no real frontal plane moment. You'd have to do something on one leg. You need to have those hip abductors want to be working there. So if you think that you need a specific attribute in your rehab, then that's where biomechanics would matter. If you think that you need to specifically load the Achilles tendon to make it stiffer, then you would say, all right, we have to do loaded plantar flexion. We probably can't just do it with a fully plantar flexed foot. We have to go through the full range because we know with lots of dorsiflexion, we'll have more strain on the Achilles. And here we look at the Achilles strain research where you need 4.5 to 6.5% strain. And we know that you get that with relatively high loads, like 80% of max. And you also get that where you have more strain on the Achilles, meaning when you go into dorsiflexion more. So there is a case where it's movement preparation is important. And then we would say biomechanics are important because we want to specifically load those tissues. Another example from the old Reconciling Biomechanics course, Pain Science, it's online, is we talk about ACL rehab. So there's a specific attribute you probably need to build, and that would be quad strength, right? Because what we know, for whatever reason, we have an archetype of patient who protects their knee. Right? This happens often when we get injured. We don't mean to. We just unconsciously protect it. So you need to say, I need to specifically load that quad. Again, you can't just do it with lunges and squats because the body has this ability to protect. You can't just do it with a goal task like jumping because more stress or power production will come from the hip and the ankle. You have to say, how do we make the quad just fend on its own so no one else can help out? Kind of like what I do with my kids. Just you got to figure this out on your own. So it would be a boring old leg extension or maybe a wall squat with one leg where nothing else can help out. So that's a case where biomechanics matters for people that are overprotectors and we want to isolate a specific joint to build them up. Again, you could debate, well, does everyone with an ACL tear require their quad to get stronger? Probably not, but if you're returning to sport and we have some research to show that a weak quad predisposes to injury, then maybe it's worth going after. Related to that specificity in sort of the psychological world would be fear of specific movements, right? If you were afraid of deadlifting, this is Mitch Gibbs's work, you can't just squat with heavy loads and assume that fear resolution will carry over to the task. So we know that fear tends to be very context specific, right? So if someone is afraid of, flexing their spine and getting out of bed or putting on their shoes, you need to do that. Like fear is very specific. So that's another case where specificity and, mechanics would kind of matter there. And the last one where biomechanics matters is performance, right? And certainly with more heavy tasks, right? If you want to be a power lifter, if you want to be an Olympic lifter, then without a doubt, you could see a coach who's going to help you tweak your technique to produce more force. So performance, it matters with things like that. Definitely high loads. Where you would get into debates would be like things like endurance tasks, like a distance running. A lot of people like me would say the body's going to figure it out. The person will figure it out. There's no one right way to run. If the more reps you get, the more time on your feet, you'll figure that out. The argument with high load stuff is that you don't always figure it out. You might just naturally default to your movement habits, and coaching can come in there. So performance, I'm cool with mechanics being important there. However, the other side of that, which is really cool to me, is like you think of the reason why you're choosing an exercise. When you're choosing a squat, if you're a power lifter, sure, your goal is to squat more. I get that. So technique matters. But someone else could do a weird squat where their technique, if they change their technique, they could probably lift more loads. But that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to do a squat to load a certain area of their body, right? So they're technically being inefficient for their squat pattern, but they're not inefficient if they're trying to load something up heavy, right? So I might want to do a squat where I'm really, really upright. It's uncomfortable for me, right? But it's putting lots of load on my quads. And that's what my goal is to build my quads or something like that. Where if I hip hinged more, I could lift more. That's not the idea. Or someone might be like, they're doing a shoulder press, and instead of lifting, straight over their shoulders, they're hunched forward. their arms are in front of their body. They can't produce as much force because they're struggling to do it. You would say, oh, that's shitty technique for lifting something over your head. Well, it is if your goal is to produce the most force and lift something up. But your goal might be to prepare to be in a position where you have to produce force, where your arms are in front of your body and you're leaning forward. This could be in rock climbing. This could be as a flight attendant, although they're not supposed to lift your suitcases, but sometimes they'll help out people. So if you're lifting your suitcase, you can't have it straight over your shoulders, right? To put it in the bin, you have to be leaning forward. So just because an exercise looks weird and it doesn't look like they're producing the most force, it actually could be the best exercise to put the greatest moment or stress on the muscles and the joints that we actually want to, because this is the idea, we're leading to some other benefit here. So again, performance is a bit odd as well. Like, yes, it's important, but it depends what your performance goals. What are you trying to get out of that exercise? All right, so those are like the big areas where mechanics matters to me, I believe. So high load activities, recognizing that of course you can do too much too soon, which is just the opposite of the movement preparation model that we have to build up to adapt to things. Stress shifting or symptom modification, where we simply say, hey, let's change up how you move. There's all kinds of options here, right? It acknowledges that sometimes it takes time to adapt to certain positions, so a quick change can help people do it. People don't even realize that they're doing things that aggravate them. Related to that is we want to build up a tolerance, right? So if there's a certain area that we want to train, biomechanics and mechanics and how you move matters, and that's related to specific attributes. If there's specific attributes like tendon stiffness, power, strength, then there's fewer ways to do that, and mechanics matters there. And then the last one, of course, is performance. So tweaking how you move to change your performance is always important. All right, there we are. Another one done with the quick mini movement optimism podcast. Adios.